going to start with the pupil premium generally. I'll talk a little bit about the pandemic and lockdown, and then about some general principles as well. And I think I really want to start with a point, and I think this is a real risky time around tackling educational disadvantage, not just because of the lost learning time, but also our response to it. And over the time since its introduction, the pupil premium has not been as effective as it could have been. There are a couple of reasons for that. I think at times accountability has driven practice rather than the needs of pupils. So things have been prioritised that are easy to evidence that we've done them, rather than actually things that address pupil need and gaps in learning over time. And as a result, at times we've had a de-emphasis of the importance of teaching, which is actually the critical intervention around better outcomes for disadvantaged pupils. But also, I'd argue, and I'm sorry if I feel like a bit of a sort of clanging gong on this, but I think at times we've prioritised labels again over pupil needs. So pupil premium as a label tells us very little about pupils as individuals. We need to focus very much on need, not labels. A label tells us that the pupil premium label tells us a pupil has been eligible for free school meals once in the last 6 years. Nothing more. We had this sort of generalization about disadvantage at times. Look, I'm sure the point has been well made that the limited opening of schools over this period is disproportionately going to impact on our most disadvantaged pupils. And Becky Francis on Newsnight last night talking about that, meaning they are going to fall even further back from their more fortunate peers. We have to think about those experiences through the lens of our less fortunate families. It will be creating pressure, around housing, around resources, about relationships within the home, but also strains on relationships with friends, relationships with school, with teachers, opportunities to just talk, structure, routine, social, emotional, mental health, physical well-being. All of those things are going to add to the challenges that our disadvantaged pupils will face. Look, just to say, forgive me, I'll make some generalizations about children from less fortunate backgrounds in this this talk, with a caveat every point that I make. I mean, within the current situation, I'm increasingly anxious about a number of things which I think are really important. I think there's this sense that the provision of ICT equipment is seen as the primary issue, and it's not. The provision of ICT equipment is one resource that might help address or negate some of the worst impact of the situation we find ourselves in. The key issues are around literacy, particularly vocabulary or language background knowledge, self-regulation, motivation, relationships, social, emotional, mental health, self-esteem. Those are the issues that we need to address, and the ICT equipment may help in part with that. But again, I say time and time again, we tackle educational disadvantage through pupils experiencing success in classrooms. And those experiences are not exclusive to pupils with any particular label. I think national programs absolutely have to focus on those labels, but we need to recognize that it's much more nuanced in schools. And whatever resource are provided for online learning, they're still going to be fallible, aren't they? They're going to be at risk of inconsistency, issues around demand for broadband, hardware, other distractions. I worry that that the current year 6, 11, and indeed 13 have missed out on some of those sort of really critical life experiences at the point of transition, and their forgotten voices at a strategic level. They're almost treated like collateral, and we need to remember them, not least as they step into their next stages of learning. I think that's really, really important. And again, not losing our focus on early intervention and the critical importance of the early years. The transition from nursery into reception is as critical as any of those points of transition. And early intervention may be one of the ways that we negate some of the worst sort of long-term potential impacts around this this agenda, because I think our disadvantaged pupils at this moment are our canaries down the coal mine. What can we do? It's relatively easy to diagnose the problem, isn't it? But actually, what could we do about it? I think what we do about it is really, really important in relation to sort of challenge partners work, but any accountability framework, Ofsted, local authorities, MAT leads, it absolutely has to be around what can we do to solve this challenge, because in all of my work around sort of pupil premium, and as a complete one-trick pony, over 500 pupil premium reviews now. Those things do not work when it's somebody walking in and saying, why haven't you solved this? It creates inertia, defensiveness. Whereas when the conversation is about how can we sort of work through this challenge together, I think that's a key to success. People put the barriers up otherwise. I think staff retention and well-being are absolutely vital, because inconsistencies that we're probably going to see anyway, and particularly in challenging communities, inconsistencies around staff attendance, staff turnover, will disproportionately impact on our most vulnerable pupils. I think the importance of that often gets lost because it's a less definable intervention, isn't it? But it's critical, that consistency of relationships, all the same. I think we really, really need, and it's a conversation I've had with a number of schools in the last week or so, resist the temptation around assessing pupils at age-related expectations, particularly in foundation subjects in the primary phase, because the curriculum has been covered in part. That's not going to help anyone. It's just going to store up problems for later on, particularly with those pupils that might lack sort of background knowledge. I think there's some interesting things to be thinking about around summer school provision, whenever we do sort of return to school more formally, but focused on social, emotional, mental health and socialization rather than sort of academic learning. And I think that point around social, emotional well-being, reintegration is absolutely critical, because if we rush into a tsunami of academic interventions, everything we do is going to be built on sand, and we'll be storing up problems for later on. And I think that sort of rush to help pupils catch up may be an Achilles heel for us. And to that point, I think really rigorous, high-quality diagnostic assessment around pupils' gaps in learning to inform responsive teaching for teachers to feel better equipped to meet that pupil need is going to be critical. And teachers owning a broader pupil premium strategy is really, really important. All the same. Linked to that, I think there's something interesting about focusing on high quality, self-regulated learning around explicit instruction to help pupils manage and organize their own learning, and sort of drawing from the EF's guide on metacognition and self-regulated learning, in particular recommendation 6 there. And that will actually sustain pupils in the long term beyond the experiences we're experiencing at the moment. We want pupils to take ownership and have confidence around their own learning. I also worry about, and I'm going to come to this again as I talk, some assumptions being made around our disadvantaged and vulnerable pupils. There are enough assumptions and sort of judgments made about pupils from less fortunate backgrounds already, and we need to be really, really careful around generalizations around the narrative around pupils from less fortunate backgrounds, around not doing any work, those kinds of things, not least because I've struggled to get my daughter in year 10 to walk from her bedroom down the stairs for lessons at 9 o'clock, and that's within a community, a home, where there's a lot of focus and a huge value put on the power of education, but she still can't get from her bedroom down the stairs for a 9 o'clock lesson. So it's challenging, and it's challenging, in lots and lots and lots of different circumstances. So looking ahead, I think it's critical that we do a few things really, really well and not overload. The proportions of disadvantaged pupils in our school are likely to increase in numbers and level of complexity and need, and that's why we need to take a whole school approach to this issue, where everybody feels a collective responsibility and understanding of what the school's strategy is for tackling educational disadvantage. It shouldn't be sitting with one or two pupils. The school strategies around disadvantage should focus on improving the learner in their own right, not just sort of test scores or giving them more and more interventions to complete. High expectations and inclusive teaching should be at the forefront of a school's strategy for disadvantage, focus on pupil need. And and something really that I got from John Tomset up at Huntingdon School in York really is that we build pupils' self-esteem and self-confidence. There are some stuff you can do outside of the classroom, but really we only really sustain that by pupils experiencing success in their learning by completing high quality, challenging tasks. We tackle self-esteem in the classroom, and then points around teaching assistants are going to be more important than ever. Our disadvantaged pupils, more generally, they're the canaries down the coal mine of our schools. When things go wrong, and we're seeing it up in lights at the moment, aren't they? The most vulnerable are going to come off worse. And again, that's why, and I can't labour this point enough, we need a collective understanding and ownership of a school's strategy for tackling educational disadvantage, focused on what happens in the classroom. Our middle leaders, our subject leaders, our phase leaders need to feel a strong ownership and understanding of that strategy, so that it isn't just dependent on a small number of people. And it's that sort of that plan, teach, assess cycle through the lens of our disadvantaged pupils. Do they have the self-regulation skills to be able to, do they have the scaffolding? Do they have the background knowledge to be able to access high quality learning, scaffolding up, not differentiating down? There is some stuff we can do at policy level, but actually what happens in classrooms day in, day out is going to be the things that really, really make a difference. I think there's going to be a really interesting challenge around curriculum equity ahead. It was an issue anyway. And what I broadly mean by that is that all too often, our children from the least fortunate backgrounds who've been exposed to less sort of cultural enrichment, perhaps, less financial, cultural, social capital, often, if we're not careful, get the narrowest curriculum experiences in school, pulled out of foundation subjects, enrichment activities, assemblies, those kind of things, with a focus on sort of academic intervention. So if we're not careful, we see the Matthew effect in our classrooms, insofar as children with the most fortunate backgrounds, the broadest vistas outside of school, get the broadest broadest curriculum offer in school as well. And there's a balance to be had there that we need to be wary of. I don't have the answers to that, sadly, and it means different things in different classrooms and different schools, but I think it's something that really need a sharp sort of focus, on. And there's a real need, and more than ever again, that that we take a long-term approach to tackling educational disadvantage, and we work really closely with the DfE and worked hard with them over the summer last year to move away from this annual reporting cycle, which was essentially around pupil premium, schools making up a list of expenditure, a shopping list around what they're doing, and moving more towards a 2 to 3 year strategy that focuses on what schools primarily are doing in the classroom and doing fewer things well, focusing on pupil need. I just want to make this point around sort of labels again too, that labels, I think they create lots of challenges in our education system, and I think they set limits on what pupils can achieve. I think they sometimes can create a subconscious bias, and actually we know, don't we, that even if we sort of use that pupil premium definition as a proxy for disadvantage, there are pupils that sit outside that are exceptionally vulnerable, not least those families that don't have British citizenship, recourse to benefits. They are not eligible for the pupil premium, but also those families that sit just above eligibility in terms of financial income. We know that, and also even within the group, that label, there are some pupils that are exceptionally vulnerable. Essentially, the longer the time a pupil is eligible for free school meals, the lower the attainment, the impact of disadvantage over time. So to be really, really wary of labels and the limits they can set on pupils. Um, to get it right by our disadvantaged and vulnerable pupils, we have to understand pupil need. And Harper Lee's therefore wonderful line in the book, to truly understand a person, you have to get inside their skin and walk around for a little while. Understanding people need, and it's going to be more challenging than ever, this issue. And we're going to need really robust, diagnostic, academic and pastoral assessment to understand the experiences, both again pastoral and academic, for our pupils, all pupils, but particularly those from less fortunate backgrounds. More than ever, we need to move away from generalizations and assumptions. The less precise we are around understanding pupil need, the less, the more poorly focused the activity that we undertake, and despite all the effort that we might put in, we don't see the results that we'd like to from those. We don't get it right in understanding pupil need. Our strategies end up being a bit, Jackson Pollock. So it's really important that we have a nuanced, clear understanding of pupil need, and that everybody across the school understands what that need is and how it might present, perhaps in their subject area or their phase. And I think they can be broadly broken down into these three categories around pupils and families. So those things might be about vocabulary, background knowledge, oral language, self-confidence, dispositions towards learning, relationships, poverty over time, access to resources, those kinds of things, a lack of conversation, talk, someone to listen to them, access to books, those kinds of things. The community too, and your community sort of barriers to learning. Those things might be about housing, transport. In this case, it might be access to shops and things like that. Transport, social isolation, and the sort of collapse of some economic security and jobs as well. So perhaps it's around communities serving coastal areas, holiday destinations. Those kind of things are going to be disproportionately impacted by these experiences. And then the last one, the one we mustn't shy away from, are those those barriers to learning that arise from our school. Primarily access to high quality teaching and learning. High turnover of staff will disproportionately impact on our disadvantaged pupils. But in some cases we see, and we mustn't shy away from talking about this either, that in some cases we see negative perceptions of disadvantaged pupils and their families, and I'll come to that a little bit later on. If we don't get it right in understanding pupil need, we end up with, remember in this program, the supermarket sweep approach to tackling educational disadvantage, grabbing hold of multiple interventions, huge opportunity costs at the moment. As a result of that, pupils outside of their foundation subject lessons, missing out on language comprehension opportunities. And when we were reviewing, pupil premium accountability around pupil premium strategy documents last year with the DFE, there was one school that had a statement that was 110 pages long. Multiple activities, total exasperation, implementation fatigue, and unsurprisingly, none of those things sticking. Absolutely, to get it right in terms of high expectations for our disadvantaged and vulnerable pupils. And I think something that we need a real common language around. What do we mean by high expectations? And I think what's really important here is the primacy of teaching. We've seen a lot around a lack of high expectations of disadvantaged pupils is a misunderstanding about what we mean by it. All too often I've seen in lessons that that have a negative impact on disadvantaged pupils, where the teacher expects pupils to work independently before they've had the input from the teacher, which will give them those key bits of knowledge. And then those discussions they need to have to ask questions to clarify misconceptions, and then go and work to be independent. You can't be independent around things that you don't know about. But also, at a school level, I think we have some challenges around expectations sometimes. For me, at school level, the key definition around high expectations is that our disadvantaged and our vulnerable pupils, and particularly our lower prior attainers, get at least equitable access to well-trained, well-qualified, experienced staff, and particularly teaching and learning staff. Because if we don't do that, if our least fortunate, our lowest attaining pupils are being disproportionately working with less qualified, non-subject specialists, less experienced staff, then we're setting ourselves up to fail later on, and we're going to end up sort of relying on sort of catch-up interventions to pull children up to meet accountability targets rather than addressing need. If I was in charge of the world and I'm not charging anything, there's one thing I would get rid of from our education system, is the labelling around low ability. I think it's hugely problematic. It doesn't serve any particular purpose rather than sort of roughly sort of categorising pupils. It's endemic in our education system. We're not talking about low ability, are we? We're talking about low prior attainment based on pupils' prior experiences, their exposure to language, their exposure to talk, their exposure to social interaction, their cultural, their financial, their social capital. And that's not saying that everybody can go on to be a maths professor at Oxford necessarily, but what we're saying is that when we label children that way, we set limits on what they can achieve through some subconscious and unconscious bias. Professor Steve Higgins at Durham University talks about this, that when we label pupils in that way, we just unconsciously we can expect less of them. We might expect less of them in their lessons. We might expect them to contribute a little bit less in discussions. We might expect them to contribute less in their work, and over a child's school career, that can impact on what they can achieve. And I'd argue really, really strongly that we don't tackle educational disadvantage through shiny interventions with folders, but through 1,000 little interactions, day in, day out, week in, week out, term in, term out. That for me, high expectations are a process, not an event. Relationships, absolutely critical for our disadvantaged and vulnerable pupils. And when I talk about relationships, I'm talking about relationships between adults and pupils. I'm talking about relationships between pupils and pupils. I'm talking about relationships between adults and how we work together. And isn't that more important than ever at the moment? And ultimately, we want our disadvantaged and vulnerable pupils to have a better relationship with learning. And the Between the Cracks study from the RSA showed that sort of the impact on learning for highly mobile pupils. And again, that might be something that's very useful at the moment. This is the EF toolkit, of average effect sizes. And I'm slightly wary of sort of presenting this because I do think it's a long way from a phonics lesson on a sort of wet Tuesday in April, but I do think it gives a useful indicator around what has the biggest impact on our disadvantaged and vulnerable pupils, where are our best bets. The stuff at the top end in terms of impact around sort of feedback, self-regulated learning, peer tutoring, collaborative learning, or language interventions, these things are all about relationships. The things that have less of an impact on average, around repeating a year, school uniform, physical environment, performance-related pay, they tend to have much less of an impact. So it's through relational strategies that we make a difference by our disadvantaged pupils. Structural things can be helpful, but if they're not underpinned by relationships, they're not going to have the impact that we want. What it also tells me that we'll tackle educational disadvantage through what happens in classrooms in schools, not in sanctuary buildings. Performance-related pay, I'd argue, is divisive more than something that helps us work together. Feedback is a really good example of this, I think. And let's sort of just go back to this slide. Most of the evidence around feedback in that feedback strand there that you can see comes from PE and sports participation. And what is about feedback in PE? It's in the moment. It's purposeful. It's directly targeted at you. Opportunities to try out that feedback, the modelling straight away. And feedback is a highly relational transaction. And I think it's one of these things that's much harder to do than we think, particularly when we see it through the lens of our more disadvantaged pupils. So what does that look like in distance learning? What will it look like, when relationships may be more difficult and more strained when we return to school more formally? It's harder to do than we think. I really commend the EF and the University of Oxford evidence review around written marking and Graham Nuttall's wonderful book, The Hidden Lives of Learners, that picks out this issue around what we think is happening in our classrooms compared to how sort of pupils receive it. And just to summarize a couple of bits of evidence from the marked improvement study that I think are often lost. To take on board feedback, there are two sort of key ingredients, really, and those are, firstly, my perception of myself as a learner. So I'm much more effective at taking on board feedback if I think I'm a good learner and I think I'm doing well at something. If I think I can't improve, I have a poor perception of myself as a learner, I'll find it much more difficult to take on board that feedback. And that's why we see our most successful learners, hoovering up, and asking for, for more and more feedback, whereas those that are struggling a little bit may shy away from it a little bit. And secondly, around my relationship with the person providing me with that feedback is fundamental to whether I can take it on board. And I suspect we can think about that professionally, can't we? That at some point in our career, we've had some feedback of someone that we don't perhaps think perhaps hold us in the highest regard or have our best interests at heart. What do you do with that feedback? You put it in the bin all too often. I personally enjoy feedback on things that I think I'm okay at. I don't enjoy it so much, and from things that I struggle with. And I think we see that again through the lens of our most vulnerable pupils. It's harder than we think, and if we're not careful, that feedback can be a gap widener. I'm going to skip over this. I'm really conscious of time. I was actually late for my wedding. I think I've told you some of that before, but so you can see that I struggle with it. But but I think this comes back to this point about self-regulated learning, and I really commend the EF's guidance, particularly recommendation 6 on that. The language gap is the attainment gap, coupled with a social isolation gap, again, which is going to be exacerbated sort of more than ever. And I think we need to think about in our online learning, our distance learning, when we come back into our classrooms, we need to be thinking about who is talking in our classrooms, who is discussing, who is having the opportunity to contribute. Are our disadvantaged and vulnerable pupils, are their contributions valued? And this is something that starts out very early indeed. This is Waldfogel and Washbrook, the impact of low income on our early cognitive development, and that correlation between income, language, sort of hyperactivity and behavior. There's some great frameworks for supporting pupils in this. Isabel Beck's work, Alex Quigley's work, and the Word Aware stuff. And there's a brilliant article that summarizes what evidence-based vocabulary instruction looks like on the Chartered College website. But this links into sort of pupil need around self-esteem, self-confidence, social skills, background knowledge, better attention, better engagement with learning. It's one of the keys to success. And I think we go back to our schools or we're working with others. Who is talking in our classrooms? If not careful, again, that's the Matthew effect in action. We'll just talk really briefly about parental involvement and then around research evidence, and then I'll close for any questions. But and this is very much part of relationships, I'd argue. Parental involvement more than ever is really important in terms of the learning of our pupils and the learning of our disadvantaged pupils. And it comes up in virtually every pupil premium review I've ever done. It can be quite divisive, and still, sadly, we hear quite negative perceptions sometimes of our and judgments around our disadvantaged families. Whenever I'm doing pupil premium review, I always make sure I try to talk to some families, and often whilst sometimes some of them may find it more difficult to engage with school life and articulate their ambitions, I've yet to come across anybody that doesn't want their child to do really well. The study from the University of Missouri Columbia is one of my favorites around the impact of, and I patronize you by reading it, but the impact of negative perceptions of parents on pupil outcomes. And again, this point around sort of unconscious bias. Parenting is difficult. I certainly struggle with it, and I think it's more difficult than ever within the current situation that we find. And certainly, on those very low incomes, housing insecurity, relationships insecurity, job insecurity, all of those kinds of things, and the growing sort of anxiety that our most vulnerable families face are going to mean that sometimes learning it isn't always the highest priority, and we need to recognise that. And I think it's trying to sort of again get inside the skin of these families and recognise what some of their challenges are. Jim Davis from the Children's Society sums it beautifully, I think. Jim says, well, it doesn't even matter what you think about the parenting. It's not the children's fault, and we need to sort of decouple that. Research evidence absolutely critical to this agenda, and I won't go into this in detail now, but I think just worth remembering that research evidence comes with two big biases: publication bias. So why we can't just Google the evidence for a particular approach that we want to take, because studies that show a positive effect size are far more likely to be published with a fanfare than those that are not. And also confirmation bias, so that we look for the studies that justify an approach that we want to take rather than use research evidence to challenge our thinking. Rob Webster, University College London, says, if we're using research evidence effectively, over time we should be less confident about our opinions because of conflicting evidence around it. But it's about being evidence informed rather than using it to confirm our views. I'm not going to talk through these slides because I'm totally sort of out of time. But look, here's Rob Coe's points around how we can mistake school improvement around impact evaluation. And the key point here is impact evaluation is going to be more important than ever. What's really key is that we decouple evaluation from accountability. We're trying to find out whether our strategies and approaches have worked, not prove that we have. If we go down the route of trying to prove that we've been successful, we'll find a way of doing it. But actually, that isn't impact evaluation, and we can mistake school improvement as a result of it. And then my final point is that I think too often accountability is focused too much on our accountability to pupils, to external bodies, DFE, Ofsted and the like, and not enough on accountability to pupils and families. And sometimes that's led to some sort of blaming of pupils and families for the underachievement of disadvantaged pupils, particularly in some of the language that we see on schools' Pupil Premium website statements. There's some interesting work with schools in Stoke-on-Trent around changing the way that they talked about disadvantaged and vulnerable pupils as part of a wider approach to creating a whole school ownership of the strategy. And I think I really believe in the sort of power of language and how we talk about pupils, and rather than thinking about here pupil premium as being an accountability burden to be shouldered, but rather an opportunity to do better by our disadvantaged and vulnerable pupils. So I'm going to close there. There's some do's and don'ts which you can access from the slides, and there's some contact details for me. So those do's and don'ts are from a report we're going to do for East Sussex local authority around tackling educational disadvantage, which will be published shortly. But here's my contact details if you'd like them, and I'm going to close there.